Hello everyone, welcome to 99 zu 1 English episode. I'm again with Ishay Landa in Petah Tikva in Israel, and today we are speaking, as announced in the last episode, about Marx's take on consumerism. But before we do that, a couple of short points to introduction for Ishay. Ishay was born in 1969, studied history at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and did his doctorate at the same university with the thesis Nietzschean Heroism in the 20th Century Popular Culture. He is currently the professor of history of the Open University of Israel in the Faculty of History, Philosophy and Jewish Studies. He researches the history of modernity, popular culture, and the history of ideas, in particular the Marxist, liberal, and fascist history of ideas. That's also what we talked about last time, where we were talking about basically the liberal connections and roots, maybe even of fascist ideology. The article that we want to talk about today is called The Negation of Abnegation. It's an article that was already released in 2018 in the journal Historical Materialism. If you want to know, it's the edition 26.1, in which you revisit Marx's understanding of consumption and discuss left positions on consumption and what it's sometimes called, derogatorily maybe, consumerism, right? First question, how did you even become interested in that? So why focus on this particular aspect of consumerism at all? What's the importance of this debate for leftists today?
Yeah, well, the interest kind of flew naturally out of other areas that I was dealing with academically, because I was interested in mass society very broadly. So, for example, my PhD dissertation was about Nietzscheanism in popular culture, so it was already involved studying and analyzing the so-called culture industry, confronting political elitism, and so on. So mass society with its different ramifications is a very central concern of mine. And so almost naturally, the issue of the material standard of living of the masses, consumption/consumerism, became an issue, and ultimately it seemed almost natural to dedicate a separate study, separate attention to this aspect. Why it's important? Well, I think one of the main reasons that it's important is because of the political development that have seen the masses and the left, socialist groups, radical politics kind of drifting apart. So it's last several decades now that socialism is much less appealing as a popular power. This is slightly changing maybe, but not enough. And I think that one of the main reasons is probably this kind of anti-consumerist approach, this disdain for kind of materialism that we often find on the left. So
yes, absolutely.
To me, it's important to kind of analyze it and maybe offer an alternative approach.
I got scolded a lot for wearing Adidas shirts, and I was once part in a discussion with a leftist about how we should all sue our own pants. And we should not buy pants. So this is definitely an issue. But yeah, so
I'm just a very poor sewer, so it doesn't work for me.
Me too. Yeah, I can't. So we need some distribution of work here, basically. But maybe before we start getting into this, because your critique there is quite deep, let's start with a few definitions. So what is consumption and what is consumerism? How are they differentiated? What are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, it's a vast topic. We can enter different definitions, but to stay kind of operative, I would say consumption is basically the intake of simple calories that we need to survive. It's something very basic. We all have to consume in order to stay alive, also to be productive, to commute to work, certain minimal amount of clothing so we won't freeze in winter or whatever. So this is something very basic and functional. Consumerism, I would say, is whatever goes over and above these very basic needs. So it's what involves a certain interest in beauty, in ornamentation, in pleasure, in self-expression, all sorts of things that are not necessarily economical and productive. They may even be wasteful as far as the individual consumer is concerned, right? He's transferring money to someone else, but this still fulfills a function of fun, of enjoyment and so on. So I would say this is consumerism. You can think about maybe a rough analogy of the distinction between procreation and eroticism. Okay, so procreation is the basic thing. It's a whole religion accepted as something that we are even encouraged to do. Eroticism, if we derive some, which is often completely detached from procreation, right, is a much more complicated, something much more controversial.
Right, and also many times, maligned, basically.
Yeah.
And then in your paper, in your article, you go and basically you display and discuss the various critiques of the second, which is consumerism, and you show how there are like a variety of Marxists and Marxist schools that dedicate themselves to exactly that question. Like you could start with the Frankfurt School, you talk about Adorno, you go to sociologist Eva Illouz, to anthropologist Daniel Miller. It's not even only Marxist that you're looking at, it's also something that is like the critique of consumerism. It transcends the Marxist schools. Can you, just for the sake of this interview, I mean, you can't go in all the threads, but maybe give us like an overview of what's the common thread in all these critiques of consumerism? What's their point that they're making?
Yeah, well, I would say that in mainstream academia and also in public opinion, the public debate, more largely conceived, the standard view is highly negative, is highly critical of consumerism, of so-called consumer society, and which has been at the center of sustained attacks for quite a long time, even longer than we presume, because it's been with us since the earliest stages when the masses standard of living started to rise. So we're talking about even 16th century. And this is the case, I would say, more for sociologists or anthropologists or philosophers that are quite negative in the main. Historians a bit different. They are slightly less judgmental. Sometimes they would just depict the stages and the kind of a materialistic analysis. If you try to sum up the main arguments that this criticism is making, so I would say that politically, it's paradoxically spread across the spectrum. It's not something that's limited to the left. It's left-wing, central, the right-wing. They all share many of these assumptions, but they give it a certain twist to agree with their agenda. So this agreement between left and right on this specific issue, to a large extent, we find it in amongst radicals and conservatives, socialists and nationalists, and so on. And they all kind of agree that consumerism, in a sense, distracts us from what's really important, from the things that should be at the center of our lives. So, but if you look at the left, so essentially we have the trope of we've been citizens. Via consumerism, we have turned into consumers, which means we've become passive, complacent. We are no longer committed to a joint project of transforming society. We've all been enclosed in this little individualistic hedonist cells. So it's associated with indifference, with egoism, and so on and so forth. A very anti-capitalistic discourse, of course. We've been incorporated into a system that inculcates all these false needs, go after things that don't actually make us happy, that we don't really, that are not indispensable to us and are often just detrimental, and so on. For the right, it's somewhat similar, but here the complaint is that by being consumers, we are no longer useful for the nation. Okay, we neglect our national duties to fight for the collective. Especially, there's a very strong contrast between being a consumer and being a good soldier. right? That's something that Hitler develops at some length, and he would say, for example, that Americans have no chance against Germans because Germans are accustomed to a low standard of living. So
Spartanic, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes us squeamish and less likely to endure struggle, to endure pain, and therefore we are bad soldiers. We are also not so good workers, to the extent that we indulge our consumerist appetites. We expect to work short hours with more gain, so that's not good for the economy. The nation can't be competitive if we embrace consumerism. So that's essentially the right-wing critique. In general, we find a kind of a civilization critique. Okay, we live in a civilization that become all too material, shallow, superficial. So there are also kind of a series of tropes that are associated with consumerism. So consumerism is traditionally linked with thinking about animals. So it's something rather bestial. We are, we are addicted to our lowest, so they are described lowest drives and instincts, and so on and so forth. It's also very much linked to a critique of women. This has become less the case over the last decades because of changes in the role of women in society, but traditionally and still today, we can find this image of the man is the producer. He works very hard. He puts bread on the table. The women are flippant.
They just consumes.
Right. They just take over his credit card and go on shopping sprees and so on. So, and to the extent that men also indulge in consumption, this is seen as a sign of effeminacy. They're not really, as frugal and hardworking and so on. So this is another aspect of this broad civilization critique that is associated with anti-consumerism. In academia, in scholarship, the first line of critique that I mentioned, the left liberal, is much more dominant. You have right-wing voices as well. I mean, Jordan Peterson and the like. But is still in kind of an opposition. It's mostly left liberal. Peripherally, that's an important qualification. You mentioned Daniel Miller. And he isn't actually a critic of consumption. He actually tries to promote, he's an important figure, he's an anthropologist that in his works try to promote a much more affirmative view of consumerism and try to defend it. We need to look at it much more, to scrutinize how it works, to see that it's not necessarily egotistical. We consume things for our family, for the well-being of other people, and so on and so forth. Okay, but I would say that Miller and his line are still a side current. The mainstream, leaving historians to the side, they are a bit of a different kind of an animal. But if you talk about, as I've said, sociologists and so on, the main view is still fairly critical, fairly negative.
And you also say that among those critics of consumerism, like many of them, if not nearly all of them, somehow also approach Marx and consider Marx's positions on that. Some in an affirmative way, so they basically admire Marx's point and say, yes, that's also what we are basing our assumptions on. Others reject him, and they, most of them, reference to some of Marx's writings. So how is it possible that both both groups can both claim Marx for themselves, although they are contradicting each other?
Yeah, well, the thing is that Marx is mostly construed as, in scholarly accounts, as a very sharp, prescient critic of consumerism, consumerist society, consumerist mentality, and so on. So, needless to say, all of these scholars that are anti-consumerist are happy to refer to Marx as some kind of founding father of their theories. They rely on his work. So if you open up a theory, an ontology that deals with consumerism, it's very likely that it will be predominantly negative, and to start with Marx, either by way of some reference that pays homage to Marx as founding this kind of subdiscipline, or directly passages from Marx will be, this is reading item number 1 or 2. So Marx is at the starting point. And conversely, there are these people that embrace consumerism, these relative minority, and they tend to oppose Marx because they say, okay, Marx was anti-consumption, so he's not helpful to us. We want to undertake a different kind of a critique, a much more nuanced critique, much more forgiving, much more tolerant of consumerism. So Marx is in our way. So both of them are pretty obsessed with Marx, but for different reasons.
So, which are Marx's writings that most of these critics refer to when referring to Marx's alleged anti-consumerism? You speak in the paper about what you call, and I found this interesting, an ubiquitous invisibility of Marx in the writings of these thinkers. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that Marx's name is everywhere, ubiquitous, omnipresent. Yeah. It appears überall.
Yeah.
So nearly everybody takes Marx as a point of reference, either to affirm his views or to attack him. But I also argue that Marx is actually invisible. Why? Because it's not really Marx. It's essentially an imposture. It's a construction of Marx that has very little to do with Marx's own position and his own ideas, which are extremely interesting. And you don't really find them well represented in this discourse. So we kind of ignore Marx's ideas, even though Marx is constantly mentioned. This is the fundamental paradox that we are dealing with. So to me, it's about, in this essay in general, in the work that I'm doing, it's a long time project of a book that I'm writing on this. So what I try to do, in a sense, is recover Marx's essence, and I try to argue that Marx does something quite different from both his admirers and his critics. The admirers tell us that consumer society is bad, it's capitalistic. Marx can help us to overcome it. The critics tell us consumer society is good, capitalism is good, Marx stands in our way. And I believe that Marx does something radically different from both of these, and what he helps us to understand is that we can and should use consumer society and consumerism as a challenge to capitalism. So it's a kind of and I'm sure we will clarify what this means.
Sure, yes. Last question towards this this part of where you confront the critiques of consumerism. You also claim, and I quote what you say here, that Marx has indeed been heavily Frankfurtized. How so? What does that mean?
Well, I think in this context we don't need to explain the Frankfurt School and the significance of this school of thought. And if we assume that to be a Marxist is to oppose consumerism, and again, this is largely the assumption, I think that this is to a great extent because of the legacy of the Frankfurt School, because of its specific take on Marx, in a sense appropriating Marx for their own agenda, which is a rather striking development if you stop to think about it historically, because anti-consumerism is a very as I mentioned, is a very long and pedigree of conservative critics, conservative and reactionaries, aristocratic. It's been with us since the earliest phases of the rise of mass standard of living. And by comparison, it's true that it has some representatives among radicals. There is a certain streak among radicalism which is very ascetic and frugal and kind of preaches against materialism, but there were also many voices that were much more hedonist, much more affirmative of materialism, even unabashed materialists, and that was their point, that we need to create a society which is much more affirmative of the body, of matters, of our concern with matters, and so on. And just to give you a few examples, it's a very rich tradition. Heinrich Heine, the poet, he was also a very good friend of Marx in the joint exile in Paris in the 40s. He influenced Marx quite a lot, and he had this vision of trying to find a democracy of gods, as he called it. And it was very materialistic. We will have nectar and ambrosia and purple costumes and so on. And very much against this more ascetic republicanism. And then you can look at Sylvia Pankhurst, another important British socialist, who said socialism is about plenty, it's about abundance for all. Under capitalism, both consumption and production are restricted. We are going to break through these barriers and so on. But this hedonist Marxism has been largely displaced. It's become almost counterintuitive for us today because I think we are so accustomed to being anti-consumerist. Yes. And this owes a lot to the Frankfurt School interpretation. And what we need to consider also is the way that the Frankfurt School were also very Nietzschean. I think they took a lot of their impetus and their outlook from Nietzsche rather than from Marx. And sometimes this comes out openly and expressly, like Horkheimer in his late years expressly said, I think that Nietzsche is actually a greater thinker than Marx. Adorno was less explicit about it, but I think it also, between the line, you can find very similar position. And as we talked about in the last conversation, right, towards the end, Nietzsche happens to be one of the greatest critics of the masses and also mass consumption. So he was talking about the last humans with their tiny, puny pleasures that don't mean anything, dragging all civilization down. Nietzsche expressly dismissed what he referred to as the lust for luxury and fashion spreading among the workers, and he associated this with socialism. So this is something social. He mentioned Lassalle in this context, and he was very much against it. So, you know, this is a lot of what goes on under the guise of Marx. Again, we come to the point of Marx as a dummy, as an imposter, is actually closer to Nietzsche when we look when we look at the facts. Marx has been silently Nietzscheanized. Okay, so when we say Marx, often we mean, even if we don't know it, we actually mean Nietzsche more than Marx. So again, I think we need to recover Marxism from under this tutelage.
Okay, then let's look a little bit under the hood. You confront basically two sides of this consumerism critique. You already mentioned this. The first side accuses capitalism on account of consumerism, basically saying, yeah, see, everybody is turning more and more consumerist, and that's the judgment of capitalism. And the second side tries to defend capitalism because of consumerism, basically saying that because everybody can consume much more now than they were used to before capitalism, capitalism is actually great. And these people refer to actual texts in Marx. The first text, as you say, is the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, written in 1844 in Paris, when Marx was only 26. So that was way before, no, not way before, a couple of years before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, but way before Capital. And the whole thing was only released in 1932. So actually nobody really knew about this before mid of the 20th century. So let's look at Marx's position on consumerism, judging from this text. How would you say are the two sides of consumerism critique, or the two kinds of consumerism critics challenged when taking into consideration this text as a whole? So what does this text give us there?
Yes, the first thing that we need to note about the manuscript, the 1844 manuscript, is that this is actually the main evidence for the supposedly anti-consumerist Marx. This text is perennially cited. It's everywhere in anti-consumerist literature. Either they're referring to him, or often they take one or two quotes or quote a few pages that demonstrate Marx as being a proto-anti-consumerist. And the first thing we need to also acknowledge, or the second thing, is that there are passages in the text that seem to support such an interpretation. It's not a complete invention. Marx does say some things there that are pretty critical of consumerism. Just one example, he says, under the system of private property, each person speculates on creating a new need in the other, with the aim of forcing him to make a new sacrifice. placing him in a new dependence and seducing him into a new kind of enjoyment, and ends into economic ruin, and so on and so forth. There are moments of this nature. So, if you stick to these passages and others of a similar vein, it's indeed possible to construe Marx's position as anti-consumerist. However, if we read the text much more carefully, actually, if you read the text, you don't need to be,
so acribic,
right. It shows that this is largely untenable, and that Marx does two main things in this text that goes against, as you said, both the anti-capitalist critics of consumerism and the pro-capitalist defenders of consumerism. He disagrees with both of them, in my view. Firstly, Marx, in this text, clearly defends the increase in working class consumption. It's a very positive goal for him, so he ultimately doesn't agree with the Frankfurt School position. But he also rejects the notion that capitalism just enhances consumption. It's very much a different view. So he challenged the pillar of the other perspective as well. Marx defends increased workers' consumption and multiplication of needs in defiance of the capitalist tendency to severely restrict both of these developments. Give you an example. He argues that by reducing the worker's needs to the paltriest minimum necessary to maintain his physical existence, the political economist declares that man has no other needs, either in the sphere of activity or in that of consumption. Any luxury that the worker might enjoy is reprehensible, and anything that goes beyond the most abstract need, either in the form of passive enjoyment or active expression, appears to him as a luxury. Unquote. A crucial aspect of Marx's vision already at that early stage, this is 4 years before the Communist Manifesto, involved accentuating the ways in which capitalism actually restricts consumption, goes against it, limits, stifles it, subjugates it to its own purposes. Marx was concerned to show how it was in the nature of capitalism to foster renunciation of consumption. Just one sentence. This science of the marvels of industry is at the same time the science of asceticism, and its true ideal is the ascetic but rapacious skinflint and the ascetic but productive slave, unquote. So Marx shows, I think, very clearly, very eloquently, how capitalism and its ideologists, he talks about political economists, are by no means pro-consumerist, pure and simple. And there's a very strong antagonism between consumption, mass consumption, and capitalism, already at this early text.
So would you then say that there is no real ambivalence, because you just said, like, if you read the text, you can't get this this idea from it, in his standing towards consumerism? Is this what the critiques bring up there made up?
It's not completely made up, as I've said. There are some instances that you can draw in your...
like quotes in isolation, you can then take
decontextualize them in various ways. I would say, essentially, the dialectic of Marx analysis is being stifled. It's being forced into a standstill, because Marx is an exemplary dialectical thinker. And what he does when he approaches capitalism is offers us an analysis of capitalist contradictions. Contradictions, vectors moving in different directions. Because of the frictions and the antagonism, you also create movement. That's a vital aspect, and movement leads to change. So Marx always analyzed capitalism with a view to the possibilities of a change, of another world that will be developed on the basis of capitalism. The Frankfurt School gives us a static and flattened account. They treat it in a one-sided manner, and sometimes objectively they change the meaning altogether. I give just one example, which I analyze at some detail in the paper itself. Here I will just give the gist of it. in Erich Fromm's case, Erich Fromm was a notable member and kind of a proponent of critical theory in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he kind of condensed Marx's position into the dichotomy of having and being, to have or to be. And he claimed that Marx was all for, naturally, for being as opposed to having. And having means consuming. Right? Having means having all these things that we don't actually need, that distracts us from being, from developing our humanity, our social relationship, and so on. And this becomes a very important trope during the 60s, also the student revolt, and so on. And the thing is that when you consult the passage where Marx is saying this, Marx's point is completely different. It's the very opposite. Marx, having means doesn't mean consuming. Being entails consumption.
Yeah.
Having for Marx is actually refraining from consuming and saving. So, the whole point about having is
like keeping,
increasing your capital, refraining from consumption, not enjoying, not expressing yourself in other way, but just becoming richer and richer by storing your wealth. So what was actually a statement for consumption, Erich Fromm turned into a statement that was punishing consumption, advising us to look beyond consumption. Just to make clear, I'm not saying that Fromm mischievously or deliberately changed things. I think he read this and kind of said, okay, this chimes in with my own interpretation, and he took us in this direction, but without noticing that in the text itself something quite different was going on. I think in Marx, in general, it's not about transcending abysmal poverty, as Erich Fromm put it. It was about enhancing us materially, and I think it's a very important thing to realize. Another example of the things that are misrepresented in our current view of the text concerns alienation. Right? This is a very important term that appears frequently in this text, but usually it's been construed as meaning a spiritual problem, essentially. So we are surrounded by a world of objects that doesn't give us satisfaction, there's no meaning, there's no purpose in it, and we don't find our ways in this alien world. We are estranged from it. This is the main problem that is that literature as extracted from Marx's text. For Marx, however, in the text itself, he detected alienation not so much in the world of objects, but from objects. Okay, so alienation affected the worker primarily as a result of her enforced separation from the objects of production, which she didn't own, obviously, and also from the object of consumption, the things that she was producing. Marx said this quite explicitly. He writes about the, quote, objectification, the production of the worker, and the estrangement, the loss of the object of his product that this entails, unquote. Plus, there is a very strong emphasis throughout the text on materialism, on the need of humanity for objects, for things. And the revision of Marx has gone so far that today we need to remind ourselves of this feature, which should have been quite self-evident.
Yeah.
It shouldn't shock us that Marx was a materialist. He saw himself as continuing the legacy of especially French materialism as it developed during the Enlightenment and so on. There is one passage which I think it's worthwhile to quote at some length, because it indicates Marx's unabashedly materialist vision. He says, quote, an objective being acts objectively. It creates and establishes only objects because it is established by objects. But these objects are objects of his need, essential objects, indispensable to the exercise and confirmation of his essential powers. To say that a human being is a corporeal, living, real, sensuous, objective being with natural powers means that he has real, sensuous objects as the object of his being and of his vital expression, or that he can only express his life in real, sensuous objects. I think this is a very powerful and emphatic materialistic vision, emphasizing the importance of objects for human beings. So the whole idea that humans can simply be, and detach the relationship to objects, to things which I don't need to have, I think is inimical to Marx's fundamental argument. Marx's criticisms about consumerism that we already mentioned, yes, but we also need to take into consideration the fact that at that time consumption in excess of the essential was limited to a fairly thin layer of the people, right? So Marx specifically speaks about idle wealth dedicated only to consumption and pleasure. So he's not even attacking the middle classes of his time, which were fairly laborious. He was essentially speaking about the layer of aristocracy that kind of engaged in conspicuous consumption, right? But how much of today's anti-consumerism that often relies on Marx, as we stated, even addresses the luxury of the super rich? I think it's very marginal. Today's neo-aristocracy is seldom attacked in this literature, and it's very, very rarely the center of the critique. So often it's just the masses and how they consume and indulge themselves. So for Marx, it was essentially the sybaritic spending, to put it maybe in your terms, of the 1%, okay, the thinnest layer.
Yes.
Whereas today, who are the sinners? Those who belong to the 99%.
Right.
You just go in every shopping mall, you will find the sinners engage in consumerist success, presumably. So even the target of criticism has shifted significantly. Now, even a stranger thing even takes place in that you find sometimes the Frankfurt School defending upper-class luxury against Marx. This is a place, a reference that I've came across quite recently. Leo Lowenthal, another member, he said, and I'm quoting, "Luxury is a good thing. Proletarian resentment of the upper class is not conducive to theory. Enjoying doesn't make you mean at all. Enjoying makes you more differentiated. I would say straight out that luxury is the anticipation of utopia." Perhaps Marx, too, could have said some things better and in a more differentiated way if things wouldn't have gone so bad for him, unquote, which I think is pretty striking, defending upper-class luxury of all things against proletarian resentment, against Marx. In fact, this is not so far from what Nietzsche was saying, or Spengler, his disciple. Nietzsche actually also endorsed luxury of the elite, of the upper class. He said the best food belongs to us, and if you're not given it, we take it. And Spengler, one of Nietzsche's most illustrious right-wing disciples, said that luxury concentrated in the hands of a few is the prerequisite of high culture, and so on. I would also say that this reflects the upper class lifestyle of some of the Frankfurt School members and their consumer choices. Okay, because for instance, Adorno, even in exile in America, spent his summers, many weeks during each summers in late 30s and early 40s in essentially a luxury resort hotel. Which is fine, I'm not filled with indignation. How could he do it? If he had the resources and that's his choice, that's fine. But the problem is, if that's what you do, maybe refrain from being so anti-consumerist when it comes to the rest of us. And Lukács, Georg Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist, was kind of closely associated with the Frankfurt School at the beginning, or was rather an inspiration to them. Later on, there was a big breach.
Split,
He wrote a famous/infamous piece called the Grand Hotel Abyss, in which he satirized the Western Marxism, including Adorno, and he said they installed themselves in this luxurious hotel at the edge of the abyss with all the pleasures, and Adorno actually responded to this, and he described it as a bad joke. It wasn't a joke as far as Lukács was concerned. He was aiming to analyze an objective situation. he dismissed it as a joke, but then he said there is an element of truth in that, and I'm actually, it does describe my situation a little bit, and I'm thinking about the little cabin, in Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. Mm-hmm. There is this cabin literally tottering on the edge mm-hmm. of the abyss, going this way and that, and he says, that's my situation, which is, slightly disingenuous. Mm-hmm. He didn't live in cabins, he wasn't exactly cooking his shoes for lunch, and similarly, Horkheimer, there are now reports that he lived also very upper-class life, and he actually took enormous sums, allegedly. That's the story that some people tell us, that belonged to the Institute. He took them kind of illicitly for his own purposes. Mm-hmm. Significant sums. We're talking in today's money, it would be like $1 million, okay, or something like that. Yeah. So, again, we need to, I think, this is not meant ad hominem, but to situate this critique in its context.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know these things. Okay, then there is a second text that you refer to, or they frequently refer to, those critics. And that is, of course, then Grundrisse. Marx wrote that like a decade, more than a decade later, in 1857 to 1858. And this also wasn't published way late, wasn't published sooner. It was published like before the 1940s in the Soviet Union, but in Germany, like in German, only in 1953 actually. And you also explain how this, even though there is a way to also read that kind of affirmative position towards consumerism already in the Paris manuscripts, that there does change something in Grundrisse. So how does this text differ from the manuscripts, and what kind of general development can you identify when you compare these texts?
Yes, well, first of all, the Grundrisse happens to be the text where Marx goes into the greater detail in all his canon of work, dedicates the greatest detail in analyzing consumption. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's rather strange because this text is not referred to even as nearly as frequently as the 1844 manuscript. Mm-hmm. This is a kind of a strange paradox, because why not go to the Grundrisse? There is the most concentrated treatment of the subject of consumerism. The reason is that in the Grundrisse, Marx's analysis is really doesn't sit at all well with the common view of Marx as anti-consumerist.
It gives a clearer picture, basically.
Yeah, it's less ambivalent. Exactly. In 1844, there is a certain ambivalence. There is a criticism of kind of nefarious appetites and the cynicism involved in capitalist consumption. In the Grundrisse, Marx typically offers a dialectical analysis of consumption under capitalism that powerfully underscores both its powers and its limitations. However, to the extent that capitalism encourages consumerism, Marx is unequivocally salutes the role of capitalism. This is quite astonishing. The capitalist system is diagnosed as one that drives consumption upwards, boosts consumption, but at the same time also limits consumption, pushes it downwards. Mm-hmm. This is a dialectical example of Marx's way of thinking, right? And the reason for this is that a capitalist has a very different relationship to his own workers and to the remaining world of workers that he encounters outside of the factory. Mm-hmm. In his factory, he wants to pay the workers as little as possible. He wants to lower down their wages because that's where he drives his profit, right? So he has a very ascetic approach, and he preaches hard work and satisfaction with as little as possible.
Right.
But of course, the remaining world of the workers confront him as consumers. So he wants to sell his product to them here, and he's open to, and he uses advertisement and encourages them on to consumption. And here I'm writing the sentence where Marx says, I will read a sentence where Marx says, in spite of all pious speeches, the capitalist therefore searches for means to spur the workers on to consumption. to give his wares new charms, to inspire them with new needs by constant chatter, etc. Unquote. Now, finally, if you stop here, this seems pretty leftist, classical leftist pessimism, right? Constant chatter, new needs, and so on. But Marx goes on immediately, and he emphasizes that to the extent that capitalism inculcates new needs, it's actually very positive. And he says something that I think will sound quite heretic and even non-Marxist to many of us today. Marx adds, "It is precisely this side of the relation of capital and labor which is an essential civilizing moment, and on which the historic justification but also the contemporary power of capital rests." Unquote. To me, this is maybe one of the most pregnant and also under-examined sentences in the whole of Marx, and quite shocking, you know. So, in 1844, the position was more moral. In 1858, it is more dialectical. The capitalist is still, the evaluation of the capitalist doesn't change. It still remains very self-centered and manipulative. But even so, it does something that benefits civilization. In as much as he enhances consumption and creates new needs, that's actually a positive development.
So you say that in Grundrisse, Marx displays like an outright appreciation even for capitalism's contribution, let's say. How is that?
Well, again, in 1858, capitalism is no longer a villain, pure and simple. It's an ambivalent figure that does good and does bad. Okay, Marx speaks about the great civilizing influence of capital. He salutes the fact that capitalism drives beyond all traditional, confined, complacent, encrusted satisfaction of present needs. He speaks about the greater the extent to which historic needs are posited as necessary, the higher the level to which real wealth has become developed. Okay, another quote. Marx shows great appreciation towards the way that capitalism takes former luxuries and and kind of turns them into general necessities for the people. So this is also something positive. Marx here doesn't simply refrain from accusing capitalism for engendering false needs. In the Grundrisse, he attacks explicitly such a complaint, and he sees this as fundamentally reactionary and elitist. He ascribes it to the capitalist logic itself. And here I quote again, he says, quote, "Artificial need is what the economist calls, firstly, the needs which arise out of the social existence of the individual. Secondly, those which do not flow from his naked existence as a natural object. This shows the inner, desperate poverty which forms the basis of bourgeois wealth and of its science." Unquote. So again, the proliferation of needs under capitalism is a token of enrichment, of enhancement of civilization. Marx's view of history, similarly, which also has been largely purified from present-day Marxism, involves this belief in improvement, in progress, in a gradual transformation of society, which is evolutionary and revolutionary at the same time. It's not just a moralist chafing his hands, oh, the situation is so bad. He believed that the present, albeit sordid and you have all sorts of problems and contradictions, opens up the path for something better. And interestingly, even private property is saw as necessary, as a necessary conduit to communal one. It doesn't say, oh, horrible, property has been privatized.
You couldn't have skipped that, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely not, because that's what creates this enrichment, this new needs and so on. And in truth, this is something that you already find in 1844. Okay, so this is not something new.
You also find this in the manifesto with the idea of the productive forces being developed by capitalism.
Absolutely. That's one of the salient features, these hymns of praise towards the achievements of the bourgeoisie and so on. So even in 1844, he says that the meaning of private property, freed from its estrangement, is the existence of essential objects for the human being, both as objects of enjoyment and activity. So again, Marx didn't simply assume that communism will abolish capitalism. He Rather, the job of communism was to take over from capitalism and continue to finish what capitalism is intrinsically unable to do, to freeze private property from estrangement, which I think is a pretty striking way of thinking about communism.
So maybe let's stay there. That's kind of like Marx's appreciation for capitalism, also for consumerism under capitalism. But what's the actual problem with consumerism that he has? What's the problem with consumerism under capitalism if Marx embraces the civilizing and equalizing aspect of consumerism? What is the reason for him that this appreciation points even beyond capitalism?
Well, it's precisely because of the laws of accumulation of capital restrain the consumption of the masses to a socially determined minimum. It's not an absolute. It may be developed somewhat, but it's still very limited.
And it's also a constant conflict and pushing back against it. Right?
Exactly.
Times,
yeah, exactly. The relationship, that's the main insight.
Right.
You have the conflict between capitalism and the workers that he wants to reduce to the lowest possible minimum, and capitalism vis-a-vis the consumers. But so this means opening up possibilities, but at the same time it means that these possibilities are fairly limited. Okay, you don't have the freedom of movement towards really unleashed satisfaction of consumer needs. And this means that capitalism itself, when Marx speaks about the political economy, speaks about ideologues of capitalism, they always stress how artificial all of this consumption is. They always criticize it. They always emphasize rather the importance of saving and so on.
Right.
And we see this also in capitalist discourse resurfacing. So, for example, Elon Musk just recently complained about how the American workers are not working hard enough and so on. So, these are the basic tenets of capitalism that make it a very restrictive and punishing system. Capitalism is a system of private property and private profit seeking to expand. Consumerism is at most it's a goal. At most it's a means to that goal. It's not a goal in its own right. A consumer society in that respect would be the goal actually of communism. Capitalism only uses consumer society to the extent that it serves its purposes.
Right. Okay, very cool. So let's maybe try to sum up these elaborations. So can you, maybe try to put this in a couple of sentences? How would you say the study of Grundrisse rejects those two sides of critiques of consumerism we've been talking about before?
Grundrisse, we find a rejection of the anti-consumerism on the part of people who want the workers to consume less, or people who dismiss the materialist aspiration of the masses as unworthy and so on. But Grundrisse also rejects the idea that capitalism enables consumer society in the fully mature, free, emancipated, fully developed sense of the term. It's not. It opens up, if you wish, a vista of consumer society, but it can't really bring us there. So it's a little bit like Moses, on the edge of the desert. He sees the promised land of milk and honey, but he can't actually enter that. And if that's our goal, we need a different system.
Yeah, right. So let's try to draw a little bit of political conclusions of this, until now rather theoretical elaboration. So if we think of Marx's position on consumerism that you have just sketched out, what kind of leftist consumerist critique that we are accustomed to today should we then reject if we adhere to this critique?
Well, quite a lot. I think that any criticism that involves elitism and disdain of popular aspiration should be rejected. And this includes a lot of what's going on. There's an exercise that I sometimes do in my lectures, which I think can illustrate this a little bit. I criticize the Frankfurt School as a representative of left-wing approaches, and I illustrate this with a citation by Horkheimer. I read a passage from Horkheimer where he speaks about the proliferation of needs under capitalism and how industry creates ever new needs, and it's a ceaseless competition and so on and so forth. And I end up and I say, you want to know what's my problem with this passage? this isn't Horkheimer, this is Julius Evola. You know, was, if somebody doesn't know, he was a neo-Nazi, or not a neo-Nazi, he was actual Nazi. He was so radical in his views that he described himself as standing to the right of Nazism. But on the point of consumerism, there is an undeniable overlap. Nobody ever told me, no, this can't be Horkheimer, because it sounds really similar. Horkheimer is just an example. It could be any number of other... I just want to make it as concrete as I possibly can. You know, upper class anti-consumerism, as I've said, is a very long pedigree. You know, there are complaints about the masses starting to get used to luxuries that they don't need. In England, when the workers started drinking tea, it was considered non-English and a threat to the English way of life, which was very aristocratic, very separating the classes. How would they work for us, even if this start, you know, getting addicted to all these unnecessary luxuries and so on? And this is, we need to take cognizance of the fact that this fear of mass consumerism is very powerful and is very ingrained in upper and middle class attitudes. And, you know, Nietzsche gives this free vent, you know, via Zarathustra, where he says, you know, a lot of people who came as destroyers merely wanted to destroy the rabble. They didn't want to share the well and the flame and the fruit with the masses. So there is a very powerful anti-consumerist, almost instinct, I would say. It's kind of a gut sentiment that a lot of people on the middle class, even if their intentions are good, you know, I'm not denying that in many cases they are, but we need to, I think, be aware of that and try to overcome it, which is not an easy thing to do at all. I think that these people invoke Marx so frequently is not completely a coincidence. I think it allows them to present themselves and their own views as very radical, very sympathetic to the masses, but in fact something quite different is going on.
It's interesting. I have a side note on this, but now that you talked about how this is nearly like an instinct, or like even a philosophical drive of so many people to view this kind of mass consumerism as problematic, is that made, like, would you say that it's maybe connected to most of these people having some kind of definition of what the human as a species is, like the Gattungswesen, basically, what Marx is also talking about, like this idea that when you have this true human being as an idea that you don't reject from a materialist perspective, where you say there is none such thing, it's basically all defined by the circumstances that the human finds itself in. But if you hold on to this, that any kind of, you know, expanding of needs, they're creating new needs, basically alienates you from that, and you need to go back to that, and that's why you need to, you know, stop thinking about getting new needs, think of your basic needs, or even maybe get rid of these and become more ascetic. It's just something that popped up in my mind. I wonder what you think about that.
Yes, it's really interesting. I think the immediate reason is political, it's economic. So you see the slaves, as Nietzsche called them, rising and improving their condition. It's your loss. You know, your position, both psychologically, your sense of elevation above the masses is threatened. So I would say that's the immediate socioeconomic reason. And the political demands, you know, we see this today constantly. The workers need to tighten the belt, they need to work harder, they have become demanders, as the popular coinage goes. We need to resist that. Of course, there are also political philosophical implications. I think that you are right in that respect, that human beings are conceived of often by people on the left, this is not a general assumption, as static.
Right.
You know,
there is some core to what it means to be human, basically.
Yeah, which maybe there is, but maybe the core is about expanding. You know, that's what human beings do. It's part of the species being is to develop, it's to expand, it's to develop technologically, develop socially. That's the Hegelianism, you know, writ large. You know, Marxism continues that impetus, and for a lot of people that may be challenging. This idea of constant development is actually threatening, and you want to return to a position of doing very little and satisfying yourself with. I think there is an insight here.
Yeah, like this back to one's own nature thing, right? So
right. Yeah.
Okay. So having this critique of, or having this idea of what we should reject, what is it that we should then do instead when dealing with consumerism? Is it like, what's the alternative? Is it like just bland, accepting of any kind of consumerist escapades and luxury?
Well, I think first of all, we need to use consumerism as a weapon. Okay? We shouldn't be afraid of it. It's not something that threatens us as people who embrace socialism or Marxism. It's on our side, essentially, if we look at it, I think, correctly, or at least Marxistically. Not do it cynically, that some politicians sometimes do. When elections come, they promise,
Sure.
The prices will fall and so on. It's not because of the political gain.
Not a means of manipulation, basically.
No, not at all. It really corresponds to the dream of a Marxist, of a free human society, which is at the heart of Marx's vision. So that's something that we need to use, okay? If we say to workers, if that's what socialism says, come to us. Capitalism makes you buy so many things you don't want. You become so rich, and squeamish and so on. We actually, I think, end up driving them away.
Of course, yes.
From socialism, and indirectly it becomes an apologia for capitalism. You want prosperity, you want to live a high standard of living, that's your option.
Yeah,
if you want virtuous austerity, come to us. And so it becomes a very, I would say, self-defeating strategy. And maybe the strategy means to be self-defeating. Maybe that's the goal of it. Sometimes I have the suspicion that, something of that nature. Yeah, it's kind of
self-sabotage.
Yeah, exactly. We remain very virtuous, but alas, the masses don't want to join us.
So it also doesn't require you to get practical. And
Exactly. And you can embrace pessimism and renunciation, and the masses have been manipulated and so on. Instead of seeing there is a lot of rationality in what in the popular demands that we hear all around us. Okay. We should emphasize this fact. Capitalism gives you vicious austerity. There are so many indications of that. It's not a fantasy. Sure, there are enhancement of consumption in certain senses, but the wages are shooting up all around us. We live in an age of inflation, of general shrinkage. Standard of living has been very static and, in fact, even declining. The amount that you have to pay for housing has went up almost everywhere. So these are things that we should exploit, we shouldn't be ashamed of wanting to establish a democracy of gods. Okay, as Heine put it, it should be a positive banner that we use to construe and to recruit support for socialism. Needless to say, the basis is not that. The basis is healthcare and affordable housing, and general health treatment and so on. The problem is often when the left creates an alternative. This is what really matters. Consumerism is bad, and why force the people with this choice? It makes your own position extremely unattractive.
Yes.
The Marx wants us to have both. So we should use both of them as a political strategy. Also, I think that if we try to think about concrete ways of approaching this goal politically, is changing our attitude to many things. For example, there is a tendency on the left to scoff at the American dream, to see the American dream as an obstacle. Whereas I think that, in point of fact, the American dream has a lot of affinities with the communist dream. If not in all its inflections, they are very bourgeois and middle class and kind of competitive, but the basic dream of attaining, of getting into this land of milk and honey, of democratized luxury for the masses where everybody can consume and enjoy, that's a lot of in common with socialism, and conservative observers have actually noted this. For example, Hannah Arendt, she wrote expressly against the American dream because it taught people to look for prosperity. What we need is citizenship, and so on and so forth. And and in popular culture, by contrast, you see an enormous desire for increased consumption, almost defiant, that we can attach to. For example, there is this, the best things in life are free, but you can give it to the birds and bees. I want money, that's what I need. And so it's a famous rhythm and blues song that was written in the 60s. Also among Afro-Americans, this is very strong because they, of course, come from the most deprived and the most restricted consumers. So there's so much that we can tap into and connect and say, this is exactly what communism offers. But if we say, no, this is something that's reprehensible, and we join Arendt and so on, we restrict ourselves. In that respect, another example that I really like is this T-shirt, Jesus saves, I spend, and there is a mixture of the dollar with the cross. Some potential there, I would say. I think that communism in that respect should insist on the fact that the American dream, in its popular dimension, not all dimension, is essentially valid. It's legitimate, and the problem, the reason that the American dream remains a dream is largely capitalism. Communism can help to get us near to the American dream, and I return to the point that fascism is useful in that respect, maybe only in that respect, because so many fascists took care to emphasize how communism and Americanism are very similar. That's a fascinating thing. They always emphasized communism and Americanism are two sides of the same coin. It's exactly the same thing. Evola says that, Heidegger, even liberal thinkers like Stefan Zweig and so on. It's a very common trope. Alain de Benoit is a very important figure in the post-war New Right. He says the USA is the capital of Marxism. And they say America is the most communist society that was ever built, and so on. And this is completely overlooked, I think, in left-wing discourse. So, we should tap into this and see how we can broadcast it to broader masses to understand that the choice that they have to make is much more enticing.
Would you then say that, maybe as a last question, would you then say that there's any value in critiquing consumerism flat out, like in all these critics that are so dominant in at least leftward discourse now? Is there something to it? Is there something we can learn from this?
Well, I think consumption critique can, of course, be legitimate. I mean, it would be abstruse to say all acts of consumption that we see around us are wonderful and we should endorse them. That's not my position at all. Of course, there are many things that we consume or that are consumed in our societies that I don't think are good, and I think it's perfectly legitimate and even necessary to take a very firm position against them. If you look at the shooting sprees in America, you go to a shop, you buy a weapon and you go killing, this is something that we need to oppose. Obviously the same with smoking and many other features. The thing is, first of all, that much of this criticism is not a criticism of consumer society as such. Okay, often it's a criticism that can be done and is done by consumers themselves. For example, you think about planned obsolescence, which is inherent to capitalism. Is there any consumer who wants his smartphone to stop functioning at a certain point? Or is the refrigerator to, these things cost a lot of money, and capitalism builds on this. So this is another thing that we can use as consumers or as people who defend consumerism to say, your consumerism is bad. What you offer is not good enough.
We need a better consumerism, basically.
A better consumerism. So this is an internal critique as opposed to the position that says, this is consumer article, this is just inherently bad. This is very different. Consumerism, acts of consumption are a vehicle for people. So if you live if you are a racist person, right, you can express your racism via acts of consumption. You can buy, Beppe the Frog t-shirts or swastikas. You can go to Amazon and order some such things and so on. This is possible. But again, the problem is not so much with the act of consumption itself. It's because there is racism in our society.
And expresses itself somehow, in some way.
It's kind of stupid to say to someone, you're racist, but don't express it via your consumer choices. We need to fight against racism in general, and if we win, then obviously this potential will be much more limited. The same with underscoring class hierarchy, which is another very frequent complaint against consumerism. It underscores the differences between the classes, so-called conspicuous consumption, right? The rich are dress up very fancily and with their cars and so on. is it helpful to say to these people, you are rich, but try not to be conspicuous about it? That's not the solution, right? The solution is to fight against class society, and hopefully this will change consumption habits as well. And here I would like to emphasize that a lot of the consumption that goes on, actually in mass society, does the very opposite of that. It doesn't underscore class distinctions, class differences. It's very much, and this is a complaint that is made by critics, we all look the same in the end.
Right.
Or the differences are marginal, the same shirt, the same sneakers, the same
fashions that change, and everybody looks the same in a fashion.
Yeah, exactly.
Fashion wave, yeah.
And this also could be seen as something positive. This is the way that mass consumption actually stresses our similarities. Sameness isn't a taboo. It's only very threatening from a kind of an elitist vantage point. We are similar in many respects, and if consumption underscores that, that's not necessarily a problem. That's a way of stressing our species being, to put it in a Marxist sense. And this is actually astute observers that were not radicals noticed that. For example, Montesquieu said everybody strives for luxury, they end up all being the same. So maybe for Marxists it's a good thing. Right? Or there is another French thinker in the 17th century, Fénelon, and he was very concerned about the implications of consumerism. He said that these were revolutionary, they destabilize class society, and we need to be very frugal, very ascetic, get rid of all that. It will end up in a terrible revolution. And what did he propose as an alternative to consumer society? That was, of course, it wasn't a consumer society, but in its earliest phases, a very strict hierarchy that would be visible. So people will dress very frugally, but you would have a collar with a special collar emphasizing you are of the upper class.
Like ranks, basically.
Exactly.
Uniforms.
It was like in the military, and you would have small indications that you are. I think we can call this conspicuous non-consumption.
Yes.
Okay, which is not very enticing. So we need to take consideration of that as well. And similarly, I return to one of my favorite topics, which is significant of fascism. I said that fascists can use consumerism to express themselves. They are also very anti-consumerist historically, and I've done some separate work on that. I won't go into the details, but this is a very common motive in fascism. So Mussolini says, comfortable life, that's despicable. The joint thing that all fascists are united is opposition to comfort. Just for instance, and neo-Nazis, the far right today, are very much anti-consumerist. Also sometimes take a position against the American dream, which ties up with our last answer. And in Germany even, Götz Kubitschek, I'm sure you've heard of him, from the Alternative für Deutschland. He also spoke up against consumption in interviews. Said you only have to go to a shopping mall on Sunday and you will see spiritually there's nothing there. Okay? So, in short, I think that, as should be evident from our times of protracted shrinkage, stagflation and inflation and so on, consumerism can be potentially an ally in our struggle to create a better world, and I think we should consider that possibility very seriously, because at the moment we are handicapping ourselves. I'm not sure there's a verb, handicapping, but
handicapping, or like restraining ourselves. Just like capitalism is restraining consumerism. All right, great. Ishay, thank you. The essay is called The Negation of Abnegation, and in the Journal of Historical Materialism 26.1. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot for all your time and your explanation. And
thank you.
Welcome anytime. And with that, we say goodbye.
Bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.